You're listening to Cultivation Elevated, hosted by Michael Williamson and Anders Peterson, where we discuss vertical farming and the future of cannabis and food production.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? From Pip Horticulture, I'm Michael Williamson, along with Anders Peterson, and you are listening to Cultivation Elevated, the podcast where we dive into all things cannabis, food crops, CEA, and vertical farming. Today, we're excited to be joined by Cale Winters, owner at Rhythm CSS. Rhythm Cultivation Solutions and Services is a leader in horticultural technology, specializing in the development and production of automated control solutions and software for complete, fully integrated process management. Cale, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, man. Well, to kick things off, I know that you were not always a serial entrepreneur. So with your background in industrial engineering, what inspired you to break away from, I guess, being an employee at a larger controls company and kind of blaze your own trail at Rhythm?
Man, that was a long-winded thing. I think from an early age for me, my dad was an entrepreneur, kind of just bred that work ethic in us. And I've kind of been that guy that really never, I was a great employee and I always respected management, but I always, felt like, especially in the world of sales, corporate selling, something that I did as a controls engineer, I was a sales engineer, and I would call on all of these companies and leadership in these companies and just continually think, man, if they can do it, I can do it, and I always had that feeling. I always had a hard work ethic, again, instilled in me from my father. And so from an early age, I always felt like I was going to build a business. I didn't know what I'd be doing, but I knew I wanted to make something happen eventually. And I went into the world of controls engineering, went to school, got an industrial engineering degree, and got a job offer out of school to get into this controls thing, something that we didn't really focus a lot on in industrial engineering, but you touch a little bit of everything: mechanical engineering, electrical engineering. You kind of get all facets of engineering. I got an opportunity to be a sales engineer, really a interview more than anything, to be a sales engineer for this company that focused on controls. They acquired a controls company called Moeller. The company that I worked for was Eaton Corporation, a big name. A lot of people probably know them. Really big in the world of panel boards, switch gear, things of that nature. They're in most facilities, but they had this vertical for controls, and they acquired a company out of Germany called Moeller, and they had this initiative to hire technical college grads, take them through this accelerated training program to teach them all things controls and automation in the world of what I call big industry automation. So the big automation manufacturers, like really the big manufacturers like Procter and Gamble's of the world, and all of the machinery and controls that they use to fully automate and manage their processes. And I went through that accelerated program really because some of my mentors at that time had said, hey, if you want to start a business, this world of controls opens a lot of doors. It's a niche place. There's not a lot of expertise in the world of automation. And, if there's a company out there that's willing to, invest all that time and energy into training you to be an expert in the world of controls, and you want to be, you want to start your own business, hey, this might be a good avenue. So I took that. And I really was always, open book with my leadership when I worked in corporate world that, hey, someday I'm going to find an avenue and essentially build something of my own. And they were very supportive of that. And yeah, when cannabis came around, which for us was in 2013, got access to a grower through my brother who had moved to Denver, Colorado. And he had met a cultivator who said, hey, we're hand watering everything. 600 light facility, hand watering everything. And he was like, and at that time I had been doing, automation for about 7 years. My business partner is a brilliant controls guy. At that time, we didn't have a business together. Well, we kind of did. We did some side work, but we were trying to figure out where are we going to go? We wanted to start a business and shape, hey, we've learned how to really automate everything from conveyor systems that are out there, automated door systems, filtration systems, oil and gas, a lot of oil and gas, being that we were in the Southwest. And And when Corey brought cannabis to our attention, I got an opportunity to go up to this facility in Denver, Colorado, and just watch their processes, and ask them a bunch of questions. Hey, why aren't you leaning on automation? And got a lot of, the cannabis industry, especially at that time, things were a little bit different. There weren't tailored solutions. So, companies like Rhythm didn't exist. If they wanted to automate particularly fertigation, they were looking to companies like Priva and Argus and Netafim, the traditional ag companies that really didn't have a tailored suite. They were ag companies. I mean, it's farming equipment, simplified programs, and these guys are running, heavy 16 and house and garden and all of these programs that required a lot of intricacies that weren't addressed by those companies. And so we kind of saw, hey man, this could be a real opportunity to innovate, to do something new in an industry that I happen to have already a lot of passion for, just, cannabis in general. And so, yeah, I mean, that kind of sparked it all for us to say, hey, now that here's an opportunity for us to do what I've always wanted to do, which was build something.
It's interesting. I find that people that go down the entrepreneurial rabbit hole, it's not uncommon for their parents to have done the same. There seems to be some kind of like coming up in that environment, it somehow inspires the next generation to kind of do the same. But that's definitely like a common trend. And then your brother's in the business as well, right?
Yeah, my brother joined us. So, Raul and I started the company, and we were both between sales and marketing roles, applications engineering roles. At that time, I was an applications engineer for Eaton Corporation, and he was an applications engineer for Schneider Electric, another big name.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people might know Square D, which again does the switchgear and panel boards, all under that Schneider Electric brand. But we kind of built this, and once Corey, my brother, comes out of a construction background. He was working for big general contractors, building really all kinds of commercial buildings, but did a lot of high-rise buildings and things of that nature. But he understands the world of new construction. And, as we start to gain traction and sell, part of what Rhythm offers are these project management coordination services, ultimately to just try to make for a more seamless process, planning, managing contractors, making sure everybody understands what scope of work that they need to prepare for equipment like what we provide, these full facility control systems. So yeah, once we had a little bit of foundation laid, we brought Corey on board. Corey also he's extremely talented in the world of mechanical design, and he comes from a construction engineering background, but just a tremendous talent in the world of mechanical design. So a lot of our skid designs, all come from Corey. So the three of us, built a partnership, and here we are.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
So what were some of the biggest things that surprised you coming into the cannabis application versus some of the other applications you had worked in controls? Like, what were some of the biggest differences?
Well, I mean, I think early on, some of the big things that surprised me was the fact that people weren't leveraging controls to the extent that they could. I came from a world where everything was automated, highly automated, and the investment in automation was a critical part of their core business, their profitability, all of that, right? Because automation, and a lot of times it's easier today, but early on, you kind of had to really educate the end users on, hey, you're investing in automation to make you money, to make you a more profitable operation, right? To create more consistency, repeatability, all of those things that you get out of automation. Yes, you can up front, it is a pretty sizable CapEx expenditure, but if you evaluate your ROIs, you make that money back quite quickly. And ultimately, when you do, you're adding all of that to your bottom line. You're much more profitable because of it. So that was one of the bigger surprises. Again, that these operations that are spending millions of dollars had so many manual processes involved. So yeah, I mean, I would say that was, one of the bigger surprises. Cannabis, whenever it came to that, it was, you learn the plant. When you're young and you're a consumer of the product, you don't really understand what goes into that. But once you get really involved in that, hey, what is actually going into creating this end product that the consumers, which we are in the industry, consumers are really brand dedicated, but really they're loyal to that top shelf product that they're searching for, particularly if they're flower focused consumers, but really what goes into that. And it was quite a surprise. And I think that that's where the traditional ag space was kind of dropping the ball at that time, because they were, well, we already know how to grow plants. And they weren't really, taking the time to understand, well, what does it take to grow this plant? And as we got to know more about it, you start to realize, this is probably the most complex plant in the world. And maybe we should listen a lot more to these basement growers coming out of the underground to the commercial space, and all of the things that they say they need in order to create a top shelf product. And so, yeah, you get into the space in the world of automation. You first and foremost, what's out there, right? You're looking at the competitive solutions, and trying to shape something around that. And then you start to get the feedback from the cultivators, and you realize, hey, man, they really don't have anything available to them to bring to life what they're trying to bring to life. And again, this is speaking to a time when people were using programs. The first feed system that we built had 22 nutrients and additives, and we don't see that anymore, but 22 nutrients and additives. And that was what they were trying to bring to life, right? Well, you can't go to Argus or Priva and build a system that utilizes all that type of additives and requires all kinds of sequencing and complex recipe changes and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, again, it's why we're here, but I think those were some of the surprising things that we noticed quite quickly in the space. And again, those surprises opened the door for us to build what we did.
Well, and what I find so fascinating with automation and control companies like yourself is, before you guys really provided a solution to the cannabis industry, we were stuck as cultivators with all these data silos. Commonly it seemed like we had one system controlling our irrigation, one controlling our lights, and one controlling our climate, maybe even a fourth just for CO2. And none of these systems talked to each other. They were all independent. And if any of them collected any data, it was all disparate. And you ended up with these crazy Excel spreadsheets where people would try and, manually enter data into one singular location and try and learn from it. But it was quite cumbersome and, not all that valuable to a grower. And now it's like it's a completely different ball game, being able to tie all these systems into one platform where you now can learn from, because it's more than automation, right? I mean, it's also the data collection. And
that's a good point, because I often tell people that, and it's one of those ancillary business. It's hard to justify or quantify what does that data actually do for your business, right? And for some, way more than others. But that's a really good point, because I always tell people, and when I'm talking about the ROI discussion, and your biggest burdens in a facility are power and labor. And one of the things that we can do, we can reduce both, frankly, with proper automation. But the core one is labor and bringing down that labor. And okay, there's other things that are harder to quantify, but like the reduction of the human element, right? And human error. The first facility that we did, he allocated, I think it was 10%, if I remember. This was a long time ago, but I believe it was 10%. When he did his forecasting, he would allocate like for losses every time. He was just like, I have to plan for losses, because hand watering. People were hand watering and doing the same thing that you were talking about. Well, they're running around 4 different controllers per room, constantly having to interact and interface with these things. And all of those independent controllers have their own sensors. So nothing's really working in harmony. At times they're fighting one another. And so, yeah, I mean, I'll talk about those ancillary reduction of human error and things of that nature, but data is a really big part of it, because when we came into the space, that was another thing that we talked to people about was, hey, not only we are a systems integrator. I just had this discussion with an organization that I'm working with, which is like, at our core, Rhythm is a systems integrator. We build fertigation systems, and it is our designs, and we can take treated water directly to the plants. But aside from that, hey, we remain agnostic to whatever equipment that you want to run. And our goal is to tie all of that into a seamless control system, overlay intuitive software, right? And then ultimately data. And we overwhelm customers with data, and it creates a lot of excitement. Some are really data driven. And I think the customers, the wildly successful customers out there, are really data driven, right? I want to know, I don't care if I had the best harvest ever. Why? Right? And going through your data and understanding that versus the people that are typically, something went wrong. Okay, oh yeah, we have that data. We should go back and look at what might have happened. And, a proactive approach to data is always, preferred. Hey, whether you're doing good, bad, you can always do better. And data is a core driver of that, especially once we get into the world of AI, which I would imagine you guys will want to talk about. But yeah, really good point. And certainly something that we do, overwhelm people with data and provide them historical data for the life of the facility for all of those critical parameters that are ultimately driving your harvest results.
You bring up a lot of good points. I think of, and we've got several projects together, so I get to work with your interface quite often. And it's a tool, first and foremost. And your average operator is collecting a ton of data between the compliance data and then environmental data and all these other sensor data points. But the average Joe is kind of overwhelmed with operations, and they typically are not aggregating data. They're not really analyzing data. And so it's like this mass collection, and it doesn't always go to use. And I do agree that I think your, top tier cultivators, the one that are really pushing that kind of A+ quality product consistently, they are getting deep into the data. And I look at it like a blueprint. I think anyone can have a really great batch or a really great harvest from time to time, but it's like, can you do it again? Can you repeat it? And can you improve upon it as well? And so I look at your interface as a way to see, okay, yeah, we were a bit out of range here. We were a little bit of an optimal target here. Oh, we had that spike here. And you're trying to basically soften some of those outliers on that next run. Especially if the results from that previous run were really good still, even with some of those, suboptimal kind of data points. But yeah, to me, it's a blueprint. And it's like, I think the key to success in cannabis in 2024 is like, can you do it over and over again? Can you be the best every time? Because that is the real challenge. It's pretty easy to be really good once in a while. I think it's easy to climb to the top in these newer states. It's really difficult to hold the top because there's just a lack of consistency. And
For
that's
sure, especially with MSOs who are trying to, absolutely. MSOs who are trying to replicate what they're doing across multiple states with multiple operations groups, and that's where data can really, really become valuable. But definitely good point.
Well, and it's also almost, think about how much harder it was as a grower 10 years ago or more before you had a full, complete automation platform to maintain that kind of consistency. So you have a great run, you have the data, but now you have to manually go and switch all the valves at the right time. And
almost impossible.
Almost impossible to maintain that consistency. And that's why I think we've seen these harvests get more and more consistent with the advent of automation. And the fact that cost of automation has gone down so much. The cost of high quality sensors has gone down. The cost of cloud storage and data has gone down. And so it's more accessible at a price point that I feel like a lot of, cultivation businesses, it's feasible for them now, where in the past it may not, 10, 20 years ago, it was not probably practical.
Yeah. And we try to, one of the things that we do, because our platforms, we build software tools. And Michael, some of the things, and maybe we'll talk about it in a bit, but we do have a new software release, and I'm excited to show you about it, particularly for fertigation. I think you'll like it a lot. But we build these software tools as standards, right? And so the software we overlay that's a standard product. And yes, we can custom tailor. We have customers that come to us and they have these really unique requests. Hey, we'll bring those to life for you. But the controls, the back end of what we do, which is the hardware, we can really tailor that to your budget, and so how deep do you want to go with this system? Do you want these full featured systems with lots of sensors and lots of redundancy? And ultimately with that, you have a lot of risk mitigation and you get a lot more data and things of that nature through that. Or, where do you fit and where did you budget? Because we design and build everything in-house. The only thing that we do not do in-house is metal fabrication powder coating. I've got a partner that we've worked with for a long time on that. And maybe someday I'll bring that in-house. But right now, if it's metal fabrication or framework for skids and whatnot, we don't do that in-house. Everything else we design and build in-house, and it allows us to really approach every project with the flexibility. And all often now I've gotten to a point where I provide these pricing layers or options for customers. Hey, an entry level, and we'll talk about all of the pros and cons and potential risk that can come with that, and then kind of step up from there to, yes, you can drive automation budgets through the roof, certainly. But usually when you're doing that, when properly done, you are creating, that risk mitigation element. What is one harvest loss worth to you, and what can we do to potentially avoid that? And those are what those discussions are all about. And then again, for instance, with sensors, the more you put, it is more data, and there's more closed loop feedback that we can get through that. There's more safety protocols that we can run. But again, it is more accessible, even with what we do, because we do take, in the world of automation, we take that, again, that big industry approach that I referenced earlier. We use PLC-based systems and industrial controls. There is a reason why we do that. There's a reason why, when I reference somebody like Procter & Gamble, there's a reason why they use the same exact style of control systems that we do. Reliability is a big part of that, and the way that those, component manufacturers, they're the biggest manufacturers in the world, but, they bring to life very robust components that get several million cycle operations, the mean time before failure values. So they're going to turn on and off way more frequently, right? The processors, the relays, all of those sorts of things are modular. And then they'll shelf products for literally 20, 30 years. So if I'm building something now, that means for the next 20 to 30 years, if that product fails, I can replace it in your system. And because your whole control system is modular, that means that, a system like we build is built of thousands of components, but we can keep those systems running forever. And yes, we can continually update them, because obviously we have to adapt with what's happening in the industry. There are changes, the scheduling tools and everything that's happening, this world of AI now coming in. Crop steering, look at what crop steering did to the industry in the last 3 to 4 years, something that was not a buzzword when we came in. Everybody had very different styles to manage their process than we do today. So we constantly have to improve on that, but we can take our core foundational control systems built on these industrial component-based platforms. They're all designed and built in-house by us. They're all UL listed, but we can expand them indefinitely. We can change their functionality. We can update them with new programs, new features continuously. And so, again, there's a reason why these big entities, every critical process managed in the world is built on similar controls platforms to what we do. You pay money for that. And it's like those component manufacturers know what they're providing and the value of that in manufacturing processes. And cannabis operations are manufacturing facilities at the end of the day. So component-based pricing, they are high. But even when you build a control system on a back end and a platform like ours that is very robust, that does replicate industrial automation, we can still get to places where I often hear from people, man, I thought you were going to be way more expensive. And I'm like, hey, yeah, I can. You want to add all of these bells and whistles, it will drive that price up. But if you're trying to come at me and say, I'm used to TrollMaster, right, or some similar, off the shelf, out of the box controller, here's the handful of things that it does, right? And you're trying to upgrade, but not break the bank. We've got great fits for you, and I can walk people through that. And usually ours will also come with a more turnkey solution, integrated pumping systems, right? We've got some really unique solutions in the world of fertigation that really there's nothing like it in the industry.
Can we talk about some of those for a minute? Because I'm familiar with
please.
some of those, but I imagine some of our listeners, you guys, it's not like you guys are like, here's our environmental package and here's our fertigation package. I was trying to describe it to Anders before, and I was like, as you're describing it, I'm like, they have a lot of layers, and I'm like a car guy, so I think about it like, I'll say Porsche, but there's like a base Porsche, and you're like, okay, that's a lot of money, but okay, maybe that's feasible. But then if you actually get on Porsche's website and you start customizing a Porsche, there's like endless customization and layers. And all of a sudden, this thing can double in cost. So it's like, it really depends. But one thing that I always appreciate about your system is yes, I always think there's a balance between having all the bells and whistles and being able to add things later too as we come into revenue is nice too. Like, all right, we want more sensors later, no problem. You guys have been really, really flexible. And I almost think of it like an onion, like you just kind of peel back some layers. All right, well, this is, there's a lot of reasons to have this, but do you absolutely need it to get started? No. And you guys have always been really kind of just direct and upfront because Anders was like, man, you spec rhythm in a lot of your facilities over at Catalyst. And I was like, we do. And part of it is a selfishness of trying to manage multiple sites and having one centralized interface to work with. So some of that is a bit selfish, but the other part of it that I think really makes you guys stand out from the crowd is, I mean, how long is your training program? I mean, you can like train anyone on this in like an hour, maybe even less in some cases. The interface is so user friendly. And I've worked on previous jobs and we mentioned some of these people like Priva, great system, but sometimes primitive depending on how it's set up and then sometimes highly complex. And typically they have like one person at the facility that almost understands how it works. And that person, if they get disgruntled or they quit, your whole facility is at risk because there's only one person that knows how to control it. And what I've always really appreciated about Rhythm is the owners can learn it really quickly. You can cross train 3 or 4 people. And so it doesn't make you feel like you're a hostage to an employee because they have like a very specific skill set, because technically you've made it so friendly for people that almost anybody that has the want or willingness to learn can learn this with ease.
Yeah, and it was a lot of our focus. So, it's a good point that you bring up. And I think when I reference that software update, the fertigation software update, you'll really like what we've done there because it's gotten a lot better. And so, but part of the reason why we did that was I went to a competitive system in Boulder, Colorado, really early when we were dabbling in the space. I went up to Colorado. I got to tour a couple facilities, and one was a greenhouse in Boulder, had a competitive system. And I'm sitting in there with the cultivation lead. And plant care people kept walking in and telling him things to do. And he was writing it on the desk while he's with me. And I was like, why aren't they just doing that stuff? And he was like, I won't let him touch this software. He was like, I've had it for 6 months. I barely know how to use it. And then he starts walking me through the software. And it's just, the reality is a lot of those platforms you can tell they were developed by the engineers that, they didn't really have the user experience in mind. Who are my operators? And do they have a process management background and things of that nature? And the reality is, in most instances, absolutely not. It doesn't matter if it's floriculture, food production, cannabis. The operators, more often than not, they know plants, right? And
well, I think that's an important distinction, though, too, for people outside or people in cannabis to realize about controls that are outside of the cannabis industry. A lot of these big manufacturing facilities have a dedicated controls engineer who your plant manager, your floor manager goes to, who's trained in these, let's say, more complex interfaces. Yeah. And they say, here's what I want the production line to do. Here's what I want this machine to do. And then they initiate the changes. Unfortunately, in cannabis, we often don't see that as a role that's specifically hired as an in-house controls engineer, an automation expert. And
really an operations guy. That's where, because that's an awesome point that you bring up, because the most successful facilities that I have seen in this space have an operations guy who knows nothing about plants. He knows how to fix, maintain, and manage the equipment in that facility. And that doesn't matter from the fertigation systems, pumping systems, control systems, to the HVAC equipment, to, we had a facility in Oklahoma that had a operations guy who was a licensed plumber, mechanical contractor, and electrician. And they hired him not to know plants, to run the operations. And he interfaced very well with cultivation teams. But, some big facilities, one of the best facilities in California that we work with, top selling flower in California, they have a lead operations guy who is so talented at running the operation and the equipment. There is never a situation where he panics, right? It doesn't matter if it's as simple as a solenoid valve is down and I need to replace it, to I have HVAC issues, right? That guy is an operator that understands that, not only how to diagnose it, but take the necessary steps to get back online, fallback steps, et cetera. A lot of things that often these great and very talented cultivation leads just don't have that skill set. So it's a really good point to bring up, because yes, in the world of big industry manufacturing, we work with those teams and they have those staff members on site. But we don't see that very often. And really successful operations, man, that's a really good takeaway for people that are listening, is to find a good operator, right? And then marry them with that cultivation team. They should work together, but you don't really necessarily, so many of these people are leaning on cultivators who have zero experience with any of this type of equipment to now run, maintain, diagnose, troubleshoot, all of those things. And it's one of the things, frankly, that Rhythm, we have a really good reputation for, is that because we provide such, the services that we provide, the post-startup services that we provide, where we will take the time to take a cultivation guy who doesn't even know what a solenoid valve is and get them to a place where they are very comfortable operators. And so, yeah, that's a really good point. And just to kind of build on Michael, what you were saying, and we can kind of get into the solutions. But yeah, we do put a lot of focus on the user experience for that reason. And I think it is a big differentiator because we have highly capable, functional, flexible equipment. In fact, in particular, when it comes to fertigation, I don't think there's a company out there that comes close to the depth of layers that we put forth in our fertigation systems. The capabilities of these systems, the intelligence built in, our direct injection systems, and the things that it can do relative to any competitive system. But we try to also put forth this front end that is really intuitive. And if you are somebody that has done this, in other words, has grown plants before, it resonates well with you. And it's kind of like you can get a little baseline of training. Think about our environmental management front end. I mean, most people need 15 minutes on that thing. And they're like, I got it. I can run with it. The fertigation, there's so many deep layers that it can take. You're either going to dive into it, take ownership. And we tell people, hey, don't be afraid. It's yours now. You're not going to dive into this thing. Click through the software. Get familiar. If you're thinking, I probably can, click through this thing and play with it a bit. But so fertigation might take a little bit longer in training, but generally speaking, we have that reputation for being the easiest product to run, though it does have, some of the most deep features and capabilities of.
Well, I think that right there is the feedback I've heard and what I've seen of your interface. And I think the whole, definitely a huge factor in your success is understanding that the user experience in the cannabis application is different than traditional industrial controls, and needing to tailor a UI, a user interface that is not meant for a controls engineer, but meant for a cultivator, and that they can easily use. And that's what I've noticed looking from controls from other industries to cannabis is, wow, these user interfaces first look a lot sexier, and they're way easier to navigate, but also the ones that have all of that, but then still allow the more advanced users to dive deeper into those layers and really have the flexibility. And that's a huge challenge, right, Cale? Is like providing that level of flexibility and custom, recipes and scheduling while still making it easy to use. And that's been a huge challenge.
That was the thing, one of those other surprises, I guess, circling back to what you said, was when we first found partners in the space to work with. Really, when we first went to MJ BizCon, because when we said we met those first growers in Denver, we signed up to go to MJ BizCon back when it was nothing. I mean, these days it's a giant show. When we first went to MJ BizCon, there was 300 exhibitors and less than 3,000 people that showed up to that show. So it's a different world. But we got exposed to cultivate. Everybody does things differently. There's a lot more commonality between what people are doing today than there were back then, because there's these big networks and kind of, again, people are adopting automation and following these crop steering protocols and whatnot, and certainly there are a lot of differences in how operators operate facilities, but there's still a little bit more commonality than back then, and we saw that. And when we signed up our first 5 beta partners, we initially did we intentionally found guys that were doing things different, because we wanted to understand, well, why do you do things this way, you do this way, and then ultimately shape a solution that you could configure. We could set it up. For instance, we allow up to 16 injectors on board systems, though we very rarely sell more than 8 these days. But things like that, where you could kind of configure it, set it up, and let it run your programs, very different than your neighbor. And all of you guys can have Rhythm, but not necessarily be running it the same way. And that was a big part of, still to this day, we are always thinking about, well, those guys really like it that way, but there's some guys out there that still feed every other day, one big giant feed, and you still have to build programs to suit everybody, and just a back end that's configurable for them.
Well, and that's where you guys shine. And yeah, I do want to touch base on some of these fertigation options you have. I think of fertigation as like being like the heart of a cultivation facility. It's like it's pumping all the blood to all the different parts of the body. And I think of controls for like environmental as kind of like the brain. And we call it a brain, right? And controls for a reason. But fertigation rooms. Gosh, when you're talking when you got started, fertigation rooms didn't exist in a lot of these facilities. Their fertigation was some reservoir in the hallway and there was a hand paddle. And there was so much inconsistency. And to break some of those habits too of like, I use this liquid nutrients, it's the best, and not knowing why, but they just do it. And I'll raise my hand and be the first one to tell you I poured my fair share of Botanicare liquid nutrients, from 2008 to probably about 13, before we started looking into, other options. And now, though, fertigation rooms are spec'd in most facilities, but they're not always given enough space. And I've even thrown you some funky fertigation rooms. We can use Bostica as an example. It's got that crazy angle on there. We wanted day storage tanks, and you guys made it happen. So over the last, I don't know, 4 years or so, I've thrown you guys some oddball shapes and said, what can we do here? And every single time you guys have given me several options. You can almost make almost any space work. You can, between your any room, any res or the multi-batch. But yeah, if you could give us kind of a high level breakdown of like, I guess the most common different fertigation setups that you're speccing in 2024.
Okay, so yeah, so when we came into the space, everybody was hand mixing resins. They were usually in the corridor. The first facility I went into had 277-gallon totes, right? And they were hand mixing, dropped sump pumps in this cutout in the top, and walked around with hoses through the facility, And I went through another one in Oregon, same thing. They actually paid a guy a really hefty amount of money, but he was hand mixing individual nutrients and sending them in 3 batch tanks. And he was in there all day, 10 hours a day, manually logging data and all of that. But yeah, things are different now. People certainly have fertigation rooms allocated. And space is really where they're typically dropping the ball. And it's only because of these crop steering programs that people are wanting to deploy these days. So, Rhythm has the most broad suite of fertigation options available, right? Because we built true batch mixing systems. So when people hear batch mixing these days, they take a direct injection skid and fill batch tanks with it, and they call it the batch method. Well, we have a solution for that now as well. But when we started in the industry, what we built was we replicated the hand mixing process with a batch tank, right? And so we were watching people hand mix resins. And at this time, again, a lot of people in 3 to 5 gallon pots, they're hand watering. So they're watering like once every day or once every other day. You go to the West Coast, you saw a little bit more drip irrigation, but they would hand mix resins and then go to Home Depot, get a Rainbird controller or a Galcon controller, set it up on timers, right? But then, you go a little bit east in Colorado, and people are still 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi on every plant hand watering. And so, but there was this common thing that was like, there wasn't a lot of super high frequency irrigation at that time. Cocoa soil, larger medias, et cetera. And they were hand mixing. So we built these systems, our batch series, which is built around highly automated working mixing tanks. And in an idle state, they're empty. And when the recipe time comes, they make that recipe. They start to call in water. They can add nutrients and sequence those for you. They kick on electric mixers, blend up. They balance out the EC, make sure it's good. Then they'll pH balance that and create this homogeneous mixture and say, okay, now this recipe is ready. Where do you want it? And when we started, most people wanted to send that directly to the plants. And as the industry progressed, as rock wool, though it was always around, it's more and more popular these days. Mm-hmm. But whether it's rock wool or cocoa and these smaller cocoa medias that you have, crop steering is driving high frequency irrigation events or higher frequency irrigation. And so that comes into where we start to fill batch tanks, what Rhythm calls day storage. And it's kind of this delineation between, yeah, I've got a batch series system, right? And then I fill what we call day storage because the intention is we're going to use it today. And so, some of the early facilities that we saw, they would hand mix some of these giant reses and say, I only want to do it once a week. So it's 1,000 gallons, right? And we use it across the course of the week. Our intention with day storage is, hey, let's make it and use it today, constantly top off and replenish as we need it. But the idea of that is we're going to take a central fertigation system and move those, prepare recipes and move it to a reservoir. Once it's at the reservoir, then we monitor, and manage our delivery events to the plants from that reservoir, right?
And
So
that method's become more popular, obviously,
way
because
more
of this
popular.
precision irrigation strategy that's been popularized by Grodan and the crop steering methodologies. But the reason your systems had to change compared to, let's say, the larger batch style systems is to do that many irrigation events a day. Let's say sometimes 15 to 20 small pulse irrigation events a day per room out of a central tank that feeds multiple rooms. What people ran into were they were limited by their pump. Is that correct?
Bandwidth. It was
Bandwidth.
bandwidth. So, I can increase the size of the pump, but the reality is if you're going to batch mix, it's going to take time.
Yeah.
Right. If I direct inject, if I take a dosatron system and I'm going to feed a room that has a 10 gallon per minute flow rate and I want to feed it 100 gallons, the feeding event is 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Right. If I want to batch mix and deliver that, well, I have to first call for water, add nutrients, balance that out, pH it. It's going to take a little bit more time. And then I start to irrigate. Then that 10-minute timer starts where my 10 gallon per minute, I'm sending 100 gallons. So there's my 10 minutes. Yeah. So that whole event might take 25, 30 minutes to do. Now, I still have a really big subset of customers that direct feed with our batch systems. We have a multi-batch system that has 2 working mixing tanks. You guys have been to a facility in Michigan, Daniel, I can't remember his last name, but they have a multi-batch system, 200 gallon tanks.
Sweet cut.
Sweet cut. Yeah. So, and they, one of the things that we do, and you kind of mentioned it, you can add. We've done a lot of addition, people that started with batch tanks because they were in 3-gallon pots of cocoa, feeding 2 to 4 times per day. And now they want to switch to Rockwell and feed 24 times a day. So we add day storage, right? We add these and we bring to life that within the facility. And people always appreciate that they can, whatever they bought on day one with Rhythm does not have to be what they have on day 365. And so we can constantly change how those work or add new features and controls or tanks or what have you. But that was the big part of what we see in that industry was just, or this industry is, the method irrigation strategies are driving the necessity for day storage. There's a lot of value to it. If you think about Bostica, well, hey, once you start to get 8, 10 flowering rooms, and all of these rooms are sunrising on a similar schedule, and they're all calling for, 12 to 20 plus irrigation events per day. It doesn't matter if it's a batch machine or if it's a direct inject system, you're going to have a bandwidth issue. Mm-hmm. If you need 80 events to go out in a day and every event takes 10 minutes, right, you start to run out of time. And the other thing to concern yourself with is, when it comes to crop steering, in an ideal world, when it's time to feed, you want to feed. Right. And if you have a central system, again, doesn't matter if it's a batch system or an inline system. If you have a central system, it has to manage queues. So if you've got 8 rooms to feed, well, guess what? Room 8's not going to feed till long before room 1 finished feeding. And if you cycle through all of those rooms one by one, that machine can only make 1 recipe at a time. So if you cycle through them one by one, you might have wanted to hit room 1 again, but you're still finishing 7 and 8 before you can even circle back to 1. You're just locked up in this constant bandwidth issue. So we fill reses. And the moment that we take any system and fill reses, well, anytime, particularly a 1-to-1 model where every room has its own reservoir, hey, all the feed, as soon as that room needs to feed, it can feed. If all 8, all 12, all 20 rooms need to feed at once, they can all feed at once. And there's no worry for that bandwidth in the way that any central system would have to. You always just would have to be conscious of. And I try to walk anybody through what their options are and to be conscious of, hey, I know you're trying to save money and not go batch tanks or whatever the case is, but let's make sure that we think through some of the implications. Doesn't matter if it's a dosatron system, which we do a lot of controls for them, a batch system like we can offer, or a direct inject system like we can offer. If you want to direct feed plants, we're going to walk through the pros and cons of doing that. More often than not, these days, people land on a day storage model and then so filling batch tanks and then delivering from that. And then you have these sub models from there, which Michael kind of mentioned, which was we call it an any res, any room model or a one-to-one model. If I've got 8 flowering rooms, do I have 1 tank per room, a dedicated tank per room? Or do I have recipe tanks? That's a consolidated recipe model, which the industry, again, you guys came from this space. At what point, if you guys were back in 2010 thinking that you would consolidate to an early flower, a mid flower, and a late flower recipe, and that's it for every genetic you ran, it'd be crazy. Nobody was doing stuff like that. All these genetics had specific recipes, and every week you're making changes. So now the industry has simplified. As it's commercialized, it's simplified. And you can start to have these programs that are like early, mid, and late flower. And so I can have now a recipe tank. And so this tank here, it's oversized, right? It houses always the early flower recipe. This tank houses the mid flower recipe, this one, the late flower recipe. And then we build an architecture that allows us to deliver from any of those tanks to any room in your entire facility, any res, any room, right? And so we have those models. And we had to do that with one of the projects with Michael as well. And a lot of it was, you probably would prefer the one-to-one. Most cultivators do. Once they've had both, they tend to prefer that every room has its own tank. There's more flexibility to that program long term. You still don't have to manage queues, et cetera.
But if you're short on space
was the driver for us in that one, right? It was
exactly
a perfect spot where we could still accomplish all the irrigation events we were trying to do, but consolidate it to a smaller footprint or smaller watering room space, which was what was allocated. So those two models.
How much space do you? So if you were going to do a day, I know it's tough. It's different for every facility. By how much do you think customers are shortchanging themselves on space for fertigation systems?
It really depends. So it's interesting. Michael kind of referenced this. We get creative. My team's really good at this. We do equipment layout. So that's one of the things you get with Rhythm, where none of my competitors are doing that. They want you to go to irrigation design companies. They'll sell you the equipment, but they're not going to design your facility or your equipment layouts for you. We provide that as a service, and we're good at it. We understand. I think when we say we're good at it, I feel like we understand how operators are going to be working within that space and try to design with that in mind always, because we've been in watering rooms where any competitor might design it. Man, they clearly didn't think about this, or this, especially once the operation was live. But we're going to design that. We're working on a project in Florida right now where, they came to us and were like, their architect, they had their plans, et cetera, did not allocate enough space for the plan. They want a one-to-one day storage. They have a phase 1 and phase 2 expansion where they're adding a ton of flowering rooms. It's going to require 16 total day storage tanks, 700-gallon day storage tanks. And I looked at it, sent it over to my team. Like, I think we can work with this. And sure enough, we have been able to. We've got 10,000 gallons of freshwater storage, redundant RO system, a direct injection skid. We've got a Nutrizolve system filling 200-gallon, or it might be bigger than that, cone bottom stock tanks for their nutrient reservoirs. And then all of the day storage tanks. And we fit it into a space that you'd be quite shocked that we were able to. It's hard to say, how much are they missing it by? I've worked with some facilities who, they'll have 9 flowering rooms. I'm doing a facility in Alabama, 9 flowering rooms, and they allocate like an 8-foot by 11-foot room for fertigation. You're missing it big time. Like, I can't even get a storage tank and an RO system remotely in that room. So you'll see those quite a bit. I think where people are really missing, even if they think they want day storage, a lot of people don't realize how much water storage takes up. Just treating and storing water and the amount of footprint that it needs, especially if you want to store more than 1 day worth of water, which in an ideal world, you should, right? That's a critical element to your process. What happens if you run out of water? You better have a good backup plan in place.
What do you consider a best practice there? We've always kind of tried to aim for about 2 days worth of water, knowing that in a worst case scenario, if we had to truck in water, we could. But again,
2 to 3 days. 2 to 3 days is what I would advocate for anybody. And I have some facilities that put 5 days worth of water. The
Oof.
longest I've seen somebody go without an RO system is 4 full days. Now, what I tell people is, look, it starts to become a risk mitigation discussion, no matter how you spin it. You can put half a day worth of water, oversize your RO system, and constantly be chasing your tail. Understand the risk, right? You can do 1 day worth of water, understand the risk. And so that 2 days is that kind of sweet spot where most cultivators, the moment that they lose access to treated water, an RO system goes down, right? And you didn't have a backup RO system. Most cultivators can take a 2-day source supply and they can stretch that into 3
Yeah,
days.
feather it out. Sure.
And
Yep.
and then, but I'll always tell people what's the backup plan even then, because you got municipal water, and you would get to a point where feeding that is potentially better, at least at minimal filtration. Feeding that is better than not feeding your plants at all. But I've seen a system go down for 4 days. We had a facility in Denver that had municipal supply water. They were bringing it in through these giant carbon filters, and those carbon filters burst, and it put that carbon material into their water stream, and they filled our batch tanks up with that. And their cultivators did not recognize it. We're throwing alerts left and right. They never looked inside the tank. They're trying to force all of this. They kept faulting, and we're on the phone going, "You're sure something? Climb up there and look inside." And it was full of the sand, and it pumped. They tried to pump it to the irrigation. They broke their whole irrigation lines down. They had to replace everything and kind of reset. And they did it in about 7 days with quite a few, 9 flowering rooms at this facility. But they had a catastrophic event. And so those are really rare. But the reality is, I try to always tell people, yeah, plan for 2 days minimum. When space allows for it, plan for 2 days minimum. When budget and space allows for it, consider a redundant treatment system. And again, it all just boils down to that risk mitigation discussion.
Yeah. Hey, so switching gears just a little bit as we kind of get close to approaching an hour here. You touched on it earlier, and I did want to come back and circle around to it, was AI, machine learning, and how this can impact these automation platforms and kind of data collection systems. Where do you see the future of the software and controls going in the next 10, 15 years as it pertains to CEA? I mean, what are you most excited about in future developments?
I mean, probably the world of AI, and AI starts with data consolidation and collection. So, once you gather and collect as much data as we do, then you can start to deploy some AI strategies. I think Rhythm, as a general statement, there's a lot of risk associated with that when you're running critical processes. And we've seen that with some of my competitors who preemptively push these AI solutions that aren't necessarily ready. And a lot of growers have hesitance with that as well. Well, wait a second. I'm not going to completely give up and let you just start managing my facility on your own based on data, And so there's going to be some hesitance or people that have cold feet when it comes to that. But the reality is there's a lot of potential for the future in that world of AI and the ability to process data in a way that really, we can't. And so, for instance, we're working with Arroyo and a partnership with them to build irrigation intelligence tools that essentially take all of this data from substrate data, climate data, and everything that we, consume, use, and provide to the plants, and ultimately make suggestions. And
It would be predictive suggestions to the grower, essentially, right?
predictive suggestions to the grower, exactly right, that you can automatically deploy. And so predictive suggestions are one thing, and most growers, that's great. I get a predictive suggestion. Now I use my tool and I make a decision whether or not to deploy that to my operation. But we will have the ability to automatically deploy that. So it can monitor, hey, these are the suggestions, and then it'll automatically, update your schedules daily in all of your rooms based on all of this data that's coming in. And that can be really powerful. Again, it's got to be proven, and you've got to not rush things like that to market, particularly when we have such a high value crop. But there's going to be some really exciting things that come with that, with vision systems that we're seeing as well. I've always felt like that was in the world of AI, that's a little bit of a gap. I mean, we have a lot of data, but you guys as operators are still walking in and using your eyes to understand what's actually happening with the plant. just to understand how well you're maintaining the plant, which is a skill I feel like not a lot of operators have as well. De-leafing and things like, what am I doing it right? Am I pulling the right leaves, etc. Vision systems and where we're seeing that, and then those systems integrating directly to control systems via AI tools.
Because essentially the theory, right, is like, not only do you have your climate sensors, your root zone sensors, your CO2 sensors, maybe even airflow sensors, light sensors, but you also have all the BACnet Modbus points coming from your HVAC units. How are your refrigeration circuits being controlled? How are your fertigation skids being controlled? All the data from all the valves, all the systems into one brain. Hopefully that the theory is that, an AI can interpret that data and analyze it much more intelligently than a cultivator who has a million things to do in a day, right? So
certainly, and it can. I mean that,
yeah.
And that's and then you can feed AI tools more data, right? I mean, you as a cultivator can tell it things like what Arroyo is building as well, which is benchmarking harvests.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, this was one of the most successful harvests I've had, and then we can just gather every bit of data that we had from that and use it as a benchmark against everything that we're about to do for the next harvest, and do comparison stuff and automatically make changes, et cetera, to try to replicate again what we did before, whereas that was so manual. And we still have those tools today. Look, if you schedule a recipe in our system today, and then you do that, a recipe regimen, so you make a schedule throughout the harvest cycle, you can reset that schedule and run it again through Rhythm, right? There might be subtle indifferences that can still happen within a facility, but again, once you start to get to substrate, drybacks, those sorts of things, and really interpreting or gathering that data as well. I mean, it can be, there's a lot of opportunity. Again, to us, it's a walk before you run thing, before you deploy, too quickly deploy some of these strategies into the marketplace. You can really, oversell and underdeliver. In other words, create a bunch of unhappy customers who thought they were getting these wild AI tools and we're going to get rid of the need for cultivators and all of that. And the reality is they're unimpressed, or they've had issues. They're draining tanks down. They're having wild irrigation events, not working the way that you think. Again, that's why it's always important to prove these solutions and make sure they're ready. And I don't think they're fully there yet, but we've got some really exciting things in the roadmap. That's for sure.
I tend to agree with you. I think it's maybe a little bit premature. And one of the issues I've seen with some of this is, let's say you have the smartest AI and it has, the right ability to make the right decisions in your cultivation facility. But to me, one of the biggest weak links today is that data that the AI is getting, it has to be accurate. And I think in all of the facilities that we go into, oftentimes we see low sensor density. We see sensors placed in the incorrect location so that the measurements they're taking aren't truly representative of what the plants are feeling. And if the brain that is making these decisions is being based off of poor quality data, then you're right. Those decisions that are being made are fundamentally wrong, and you get some crazy mistakes happening in the facility. And that's where it's, to me, I feel like it's almost the hardware side that needs to catch up a little bit, whether that's the cost of hardware so that you can get more sensor density to have a better average and have better likelihood those sensors are placed in the right position, or just more accurate sensors that are, better mounting solutions, whatever it is, so that these sensors are in the right place.
Yeah, I mean, we've made pivots on sensors. We're now using Apogee SM500 full spectrum sensors, and a lot of that is, just trying to continually improve our offerings, and great company to work with. We've really liked deploying those sensors. But same thing, on the substrate. I mean, you've seen what Arroyo did. They released, everybody loved the Terros 12. Now they're claiming the Terros 1 is 10 times more accurate than the Terros 12. And assuming that the third-party white papers, et cetera, that they've had put forth are true, well, that's a great thing, right? Everybody benefits from that, and AI tools will benefit from that. And it's a really strong point. I mean, that's the same thing with EC and pH sensors that need to be consistently calibrated, cleaned and calibrated in order to operate. Any equipment that we build as controls people only functions as reliable as the sensor that's giving it data back.
It's like classic garbage in, garbage out, right?
Exactly right. So I mean, you can really quickly take an AI tool who doesn't really know whether or not that sensor data, how is it to know whether that's an accurate reading of temperature or substrate? You know, and then it can take you down some wild paths really quick, especially if you remove the human element completely. So yeah.
Well, I know this could be a 2 or 3 hour conversation, but we do have to wrap it up a little bit. But for those that are interested in learning more about Rhythm, what is the best way to get a hold of you guys, or yeah, how do they find you?
Well, we're not hard to find. You can send us direct messages on Instagram. You can go on to rhythmcss.com. That's C Cultivation Solutions and Services. Rhythmcss.com. You can check out the website. There's a short form you can fill out there. If you hit submit on that, it'll go to a team, including myself. And you know, we've got 800 numbers published. You can email us at sales@rhythmcss.com. But again, the easiest way, if you really want to get a hold of us, hop on to rhythmcss.com, submit a quick web form. You'll have somebody reach out to you, if not within the first 15 minutes, certainly within the first couple hours, unless it's a night or weekend. Be patient with us there, but we'll get in touch with you quick. We will, you know, and then we like to take you through this engagement process that's pretty, you know, intimate. I'm going to want to get to understand your facility, what your needs are, what are your goals, short term and long term, and we're going to work together to shape a solution that helps align with those goals, budgetary goals, as well as your operational goals, short term and long term. So yeah, I mean, if you want to get a hold of us, like I said, hop on that website, submit a form, and we'll be in touch soon.